Right now it's showing all three of us. Is it supposed to be doing that?
I think so. I see you, big.
Oh, just me?
I see the three at the top, myself and Bonnie also.
I'm seeing all of us in gallery view, so I was just making sure. Okay, I will go ahead and start. Okay, hello everyone, and welcome to our webinar focusing on the spatial politics of oil and indigeneity, a discussion about the role of design thinking and representation in light of the recent case McGirt versus the state of Oklahoma. My name is Alex O'Connell, and I am a second-year student at OU Tulsa pursuing a master's degree in urban design. I am also the president of our student organization, the Society of Urban Design Students. On behalf of the Society of Urban Design Students, we appreciate you joining us today to hear from an accomplished design professional and fellow OU scholar. Adelle York is an urban researcher and architectural designer. Her research is at the intersection of sovereignty, resource extraction, and urbanization, examining the ways in which territory is expressed as it relates to global oil capital. She is the digital producer of the Davis Center for Russian and Eurasian Studies at Harvard University and a partner and director of research at Plural Office Architecture and Research. Adelle received her Bachelor of Architecture with special distinction from the University of Oklahoma and a Master in Design Studies in Urbanism, Landscape, and Ecology from the Harvard University Graduate School of Design. She has worked as a designer in Texas, Oklahoma, and Washington, and has taught design studios with the Harvard Design Discovery Program and the Art Institute of Seattle. She has been a design critic at Boston Architectural College, Wentworth Institute of Technology, the University of Washington, the University of Texas, and lastly, the University of Oklahoma. Please welcome Adelle.
Okay, thank you. Hopefully everyone can see me okay. I'll share my screen in a moment, but thanks so much, Virginia, for the Alex, for the kind introduction, and to the Society of Urban Design Students for the opportunity to talk with you all today. It's a true pleasure to be amongst Tulsans and the University of Oklahoma community. These are both communities I've called my own in the past, and I'm very thankful for the chance to connect with you again. I'd first like to acknowledge your presence, if you're in Tulsa, on the traditional lands of the Osage people and now the reservation land of the Muskogee Creek Nation. I'm currently in Austin, Texas, on the traditional homelands of the Jumano, Coahuitecan, Tonkawa, Namana, or Comanche tribes. I'm grateful to be able to practice on these lands, and I'm actively working towards meaningful allyship through design. So first, I really appreciate everyone taking time out of your day, whether it be from midterms, working from home and juggling pets, kids, masks, or simply finding a new balance in these odd times. Perhaps you find yourself on uncertain grounds, wondering what will change now that you live on Muskogee Creek Nation reservation land. Unfortunately, I'm not here to talk definitively about those particulars. They're currently being negotiated by the state of Oklahoma and the 5 tribal councils, some with dedicated committees. I'm not a lawyer, nor am I a member of the Muskogee Creek Nation or other indigenous tribe. I am, however, a designer and territorial thinker, using my background in architecture as a means to better represent histories and futures that are less often told. So as you know, on July 9th, 2020, the US Supreme Court decided on McGirt versus Oklahoma, a momentous decision that has set in motion the repatriation of nearly 20 million acres of land to the 5 tribes it was taken from over a century ago. Not only is this an unprecedented return of land, but it's also an opportunity for cities and tribes to continue to work together more closely, much like Tulsa and the Creek Nation have for so long. It opens up a window into greater civic engagement and tribal collaboration for planners and designers. Our ability to represent the world graphically allows us the privilege of engagement with a larger audience and a voice to make things that have long been invisible, visible. I look forward to sharing in a discussion about these possibilities. Let Let me go ahead and share my screen. So as Alex mentioned, I received my Bachelor's of Architecture from the Gibbs College of Architecture in 2012. And after that, I worked in Tulsa for a Muskogee-owned architecture firm called One Architecture, which many of you may be familiar with. They're in the Pearl District. There, I had the amazing opportunity and privilege to work very closely with several different tribes, primarily the Muskogee Creek Nation and the Seminole Nation of Oklahoma. There I became aware of the state's history, the tribe's culture and people, and the complexity that underlies infrastructural and architectural development on tribal lands. I'm very grateful to have had that opportunity and believe that it set me on this path of research that I would have not undertaken otherwise. So many thanks are due to Shelby Navarro for creating a space for non-Native people to connect with tribal culture and foster allyship. So since my time in Oklahoma, I co-founded a practice, an architecture and research practice called Plural Office. We do work at the intersection of social justice and forward-thinking building science, what some would call climate justice. So today I'd like to share part of that research that the practice is engaged in. The work is a continuation of research I began at the Harvard Graduate School of Design, funded in part by the Harvard University Native American Program and with help from many scholars, lawyers, historians, and tribal members along the way. Most of this research was done before McGirt was heard in the Supreme Court. It was done even before anyone thought this could be a reality, including my professor at the Harvard Law School, Bob Anderson of the Boisfort Band of the Minnesota Chippewa tribe. Because of this case wasn't really even on the radar of as many people as it is now. And a good amount of my research was just figuring out sort of what the heck was going on and talking to a lot of people who weren't very familiar with Oklahoma. Many thanks are due to the historians at the Oklahoma History Center, the Creek Nation Attorneys General, Jesse Allen and Assistant Joetta Topa, Richard Murray at the Oklahoma Geological Society, Richie Tarver at the Oklahoma Petroleum Information Center, J.D. Colbert of the Creek Nation, and to many Indigenous and non-Indigenous scholars writing about sovereignty, decolonization, and resource extraction. These include my research advisor, Eve Blau, the Director of Research at the Graduate School of Design, Bobby Pietrusco, Eve Tuck, Kay Wayne Yang, Stephen Newcomb, Rania Gosen, Donna Haraway, and others. So in the next 30 minutes or so, I'll be sharing an animation that describes a narrative history of tribal territories in Oklahoma. I'll touch on the case McGirt versus Oklahoma and its predecessor Carpenter versus Murphy and Sharp versus Murphy, and some of the potential changes in its wake. I'll also delve into the creation of these visual narratives to create new forms of research and inquiry using a borrowed term from Eve Blau called the media practice. And after the presentation, I hope that we'll have 20 to 30 minutes to engage in discussion and questions. So I'll start the first section of context with a bit of imagery about Oklahoma. Most of you are probably very familiar with a lot of this imagery if you live in Tulsa or around. But perhaps these narratives are so ingrained in our daily culture that we become desensitized to some of their meaning and history. So this spread is a snapshot of the various ways in which statehood, tribal culture, and oil are so very intertwined. So the bottom right-hand corner is the Tulsa Driller on the land of the Muskogee Creek Nation River Expo. To its left is Enoch Kelly's statue, the Guardian, above the state capitol. And then in the top right, the Sooner Schooner, where many of us have likely heard the phrase sung, Boomer Sooner, and which is a call response reminder of the invasion of Indian territory. But there has been no better reminder of the linkage of statehood, tribes, and oil than the recent case of McGirt versus Oklahoma. So this July, as you know, the United States Supreme Court decided on the case, which returned nearly half of Oklahoma to indigenous reservation land. The ensuing confusion and complexity of this outcome has only just begun, but despite the widespread discussion and speculation about the future of Oklahoma, there's been a surprising lack of contemporary graphics to really understand it in its geographical context. So having said that, Here you can see the relative size of the aggregated land of these 5 tribes, the Muskogee, Seminole, Choctaw, Cherokee, and Chickasaw nations, which have just under 900,000 citizens, a population of 1.8 million, and again, it's nearly 20 million acres of land. And this is compared to what was previously the largest reservation in the United States, the Navajo Reservation, at 14 million acres. And to put the size of this land that McGirt has affected into context for any out-of-state viewers, that's 3 times the size of Massachusetts, so it's really big. So if we look a little bit closer, at each of these tribal areas, several interesting conditions begin to emerge. And the first is that this eastern half contains 48% of the state's population, 1.8 million residents. And then the second is that it also almost entirely encompasses the Tulsa metropolitan area of nearly 1 million residents. So this is an incredibly unique condition in the history of tribal land, where overnight a reservation is encompassed by a city. The Creek Nation alone has a citizenship of 90,000, is 3.1 million acres, and encompasses 11 counties. But aside from its human occupants and measurable area, this land contains a vast network of ecologies, both human-made and not. So here you can see the water bodies that flow below these boundaries, the major oil basins, major and minor pipelines, and railway lines. You can also see how clearly these ecologies do not respect sort of invisible boundary lines, private property, or even the newly formed territorial boundaries of the Creek Nation. So these are the very infrastructures that and resources that make McGirt such a momentous decision. Because resources like oil and water and infrastructure like cities and railroads are at stake. And now all of these elements potentially find themselves under a different jurisdiction. So before we dive into McGirt, we need to take a little foray into history, into Oklahoma history, to better understand how the main question of the case was escalated to the Supreme Court and why it has been contested for over 100 years. The following animation describes the readjustment of the Creek Nation boundary from the 1790s until 1907, when Oklahoma became a state. So this animation puts into dialogue archival documents, GIS data, historical maps, and photographs. So here, the late 1700s, you can see Indian Territory as west of the Mississippi as part of the Louisiana Purchase, the Muskogee Creek Nation Territory to the bottom right-hand side, and slowly cessions to the United States government as its territory is being diminished. The reduction in Indian Territory then to the left, and then as we all are familiar with, the Trail of Tears, which forcefully relocated many tribes from the southeast into what was then Indian Territory. So as Indian Territory is gradually diminished, it starts to become a shape that is more familiar to us, what we know as Oklahoma today. Soon will be highlighted the boundary of at that point, the territory of the Muskogee Creek Nation, and then the rest of it as Indian Territory. So as this plays, you'll see various configurations of Indian Territory, of different tribal territory within it. And so this next 2 sections describe some of the forces that may have been behind some of those, the loss of that land. So one of them is the race to Indian Territory, the development of railroads in the area, which Congress said, whichever railroad company reaches the northern boundary of Indian Territory first is authorized to build through tribal lands. So again, highlighting the Muskogee Creek Nation Territory, very familiar as the shape we know it today. And then on the left-hand side, several pieces of archival material that I had found in the Oklahoma Historical Society that really start to tie in this tribal tribal territories, statehood, infrastructural development, and sort of westward expansion altogether. So if you look on the left-hand side, the first sentence says, "It was the coming of the railroad that really brought civilization to Oklahoma. Indians protested vigorously." So this is a very common narrative of Indian territory at this time, that it was vacant, it was uncivilized. And you'll see that in a lot of the archival documents, is this, this sort of narrative way of projecting a situation that may or may not have been the case. And again, a piece of archival material I found in the archives showing a train, and in its smoke plume, a tribal member on horseback, sort of, again, linking this infrastructural development to the pursuit of tribal land. And then finally, this seemingly natural evolution of transportation, starting with tribes in 1820 on the plains, going through the evolution of a covered wagon to different types of railway transportation. So this next section is about allotment, which was the federally mandated policy of taking communally held reservation land and disaggregating it into private property that then could be sold for westward expansion, oil drillers, railroad companies for easements, etc. So this next section shows various ways that Indian Territory is again being diminished. Oklahoma Territory is now the western, northwestern part of the state, and different areas of land that were opened for settlement, either by presidential proclamation or through land run, which we'll see in a moment. This piece on the left is something, it's a piece of a newspaper article that many people are likely familiar with, but it's the land run of 1889. The gates are swung open at high noon. The grand rush of the boomers is begun. And the portion that's highlighted at the bottom, "and a vacant territory becomes an empire in a few hours." Again, the establishment of this narrative that the land was vacant, it was uncivilized, it was sort of fit for an invasion in certain ways. So here you can see on the map in the center, the lining of the boomers or Sooners on the northern edge of the territory into lands that were open for settlement. So this is one of the last maps created before Oklahoma and Indian Territory became the state of Oklahoma in 1907. So this is showing Indian Territory. The federal government is starting to become more interested in surveying it, which is sort of a telltale sign of future dispossession of those lands. And then in 1905, the 5 tribes that comprise the eastern half of Oklahoma banded together and petitioned for a new state of Sequoia. And so this would have comprised the 5 tribes. The shape might be sort of familiar to you at this point. This is also the 5 tribes that are affected and the same area that is affected by the McGirt decision. Okay. So now that we've been refreshed on some history, we know a little bit about how the Creek Nation territories were diminished and some of the forces behind those changes. Let's jump into the cases. So in order to understand the potential effects of McGirt, it's important to first note the legal history that led up to it. It began with a case against Mr. Murphy, a tribal citizen charged with murder in an Oklahoma court. Murder, as you might expect, is classified by the law as a major crime, and other major crimes include serious assaults, sex offenses, abductions, missing persons, and some robberies. So the McGirt case, in essence, was heard in the United States Supreme Court because it had the same fundamental legal characteristics as Carpenter. The crime committed was a major crime, both perpetrators were tribal members, and the defense claimed that the crime occurred in Indian country. So in fact, the very question of the case hinges on this last component, that the crime occurred in Indian country. The first sentence of the McGirt decision begins with, the Major Crimes Act provides that any Indian who commits certain enumerated offenses shall be subject to the same law and penalties as all other persons committing any of those offenses within the exclusive jurisdiction of the United States. So how is Indian country defined? For the purposes of keeping the legalese at minimum and also to keep everyone sort of awake at lunch, I've abbreviated these definitions of Indian country here. So there are 4 ways it can be classified: reservations, dependent Indian communities, allotments, the Indian titles to which have not been extinguished, and lands held by the federal government in trust for Indian tribes that exist outside of the formal reservations. So the defense has argued that the Creek Nation is still a reservation, definition A, and that it was never disestablished, and therefore is still classified as Indian country. So the significance of these cases are not in their particulars, but in their primary question posed to the United States Supreme Court. Does the Creek Nation reservation still exist? And by extension, do the reservation boundaries of the 4 other tribes that have similar histories, do they exist as well? So we can ground this a bit more spatially with using the Carpenter case as an example. In 1999, Patrick Dwayne Murphy was convicted of the murder of George Jacobs in an Oklahoma court, and as a state law, sentenced to death. Both men were citizens of the Muskogee Creek Nation, and the defense claimed that the crime occurred in Indian country. For the defendant, Mr. Murphy, this spatial determination is a matter of literal life or death. Major crimes occurring in Indian country fall within federal jurisdiction, making capital punishment an unlikely outcome, whereas major crimes elsewhere fall within state jurisdiction. Oklahoma is one of the highest ranking states for convict executions, which you'd understand why the defendant was vying for federal oversight at that point. So the defendant appealed the Oklahoma court's ruling, claiming that the state illegally asserted jurisdiction in Indian country, and that the Creek Nation territory still existed as delineated by its reservation boundary. As we know, Indian Territory became the state of Oklahoma in 1907, and since then, many have assumed that the boundary of the Creek Nation no longer exists. And similar to the other 4 of the 5 tribes in that area. So had the courts decided that the Creek Nation territory was not Indian country, either because allotment had removed so much tribal land from the boundaries, or because it was assumed that when Oklahoma became a state, the reservations disappeared. The Major Crimes Act would have applied, state courts would have jurisdiction, and to keep things simple, things more or less stay the same. But since the courts did decide that the Creek Nation territory is Indian country, the Major Crimes Act applies. Federal courts have jurisdiction over major crimes with several caveats. And to keep things really simple, things change. Some of those potential changes could be the determination of tribal criminal jurisdiction, oil and gas regulations, environmental regulations, and taxation. So, in fact, one of the earliest and loudest voices against this, if we go back, oil and gas regulations and taxation, even environmental regulations, is the petroleum industry. So the Oklahoma Independent Petroleum Association filed this amicus brief in the first case that was heard in the United States Supreme Court, Carpenter versus Murphy. And it's well aware of the potential effects. It says it could subject business owners to tribal taxes, exempt tribes and their members from state taxes, subject non-Indians to tribal land use regulations, affect the alienability of oil and gas leases, and dramatically change the environmental regulation of oil and gas wells. So if we break that down a little bit further, this is a current snapshot of how things were, or a snapshot of how things were before McGirt was decided. So the state both had the authority to tax oil and gas operations as well as determine environmental law, and that was shared jointly with the federal government. And then now under McGirt, the tribes and the state jointly shared the authority to tax, and the tribes and the federal government jointly have the authority to determine environmental regulations. So McGirt has so much more to do, though, with citizenship and identity over, oil and gas regulations and who has the authority to tax. So this is, I think, a nice reminder that it has much more to do with the citizenship and identity of both the tribes and Eastern Oklahomans. So it's a good reminder that there's much more at stake. So I hope to have clarified a little bit of McGirt. I know it's a complex case. A lot of the particulars are actually outlined in a podcast I'm sure you're well aware of called This Land by Rebecca Nagel. And that goes into Carpenter versus Murphy, the original case that was heard in the United States Supreme Court. So for further clarification, you might reference that. It's a very good podcast. So now I'd like to shift gears and talk a little bit about how this research was produced, show two more animations, and how the research was produced, for what aims, and the agency that we as urban thinkers and designers have in using our skills to create new political imaginations. So new ways of talking and engaging and thinking about our world. So before I show these two animations, I'd like to share some of the work of Design Earth, a practice that has inspired me and one that uses visual storytelling to speculate on possible futures related to oil and territory. I recently listened to a talk from Rania called Carbon Fictions, and she says, "I draw upon design to ground us in the messy and unruly specificities of the planet." And I think this is just a nice way to sort of understand our agency as designers, to comprehend and convey really complex parts about our world. So the first animation I'll show is really the beginning of the research that I have done, and it started with several simple questions. One is, when was oil discovered in Oklahoma, and how did this affect the reduction of tribal territories? To answer this question, I undertook a project that was both the act of research discovery as well as the final product. The act of finding and animating the data was not the research in and of itself, but overlaying, animating, and adding a temporal aspect created the new research. It became an animation that integrated dates of tribal land cessions with the rise of oil in urban centers in Oklahoma. So this is one of the first maps I made that really led me on this research pursuit. And it shows the top 5 producing states in oil and natural gas, overlaid with tribal territories in the United States. So you can see that Oklahoma is the only state with a significant amount of tribal territories, and also is a leader in oil and natural gas production. So this animation overlaps pipelines, their density is represented in a topographic map, and land cessions by tribes to the United States. So here we can see this intersection of major density of pipelines in Cushing. Here, those pipelines are represented as a topographical surface. And you can see there's, of course, at the Gulf and then at the Great Lakes. So as we overlap this with tribal territories, we can see a very unique condition occurs. So this area went from millennia of indigenous occupation to the nationally designated repository for relocated native tribes, to a land grab, to a highly productive extractive state. So the following section says, how did this happen? So it's really important to remember that there were tribes that existed on this land prior to the forced relocation of the 34 tribes that were relocated from the Southeast and Great Lakes regions. This portion of the animation, I'd like to stop it and explain just a little bit, because this will soon form the shape of Oklahoma. But what you will be seeing is, as a red shape appears, that means that the tribe has been relocated to Indian territory at that point. When it disappears, it means the land has been ceded to the United States. There's a timeline that's running at the bottom that helps sort of interface that relocation and subsequent cession of land with major events, the allotment era, the discovery of oil, and statehood. So I think an important thing to note, and we can talk a little bit more about this in the discussion period, is this was a pretty labor-intensive aggregation of a bunch of data and spreadsheets, and then geospatial data to make this animation. So you can see the growth of Oklahoma City and Tulsa, and the black shapes are capitalized oil basins. So as the thickness of their outline grows, it represents the amount of oil that has been extracted from those basins. So in the last 60 years, Oklahoma has become one of the top 5 producing states in natural gas and crude oil, boasting 25% of its economy is dependent on the energy industry. So at the time that I made this animation, the Osage Nation was currently the only tribe that had reservation land in Oklahoma, but I think I need to update it based on McGirt now. So I have one more video, one more animation to show, but before I do that, I'd like to share 3 different tenets of the creation of this research that might be useful to think about as you view them. One is the use of a 45-degree axonometric section. And just to give you a little bit of preview, that is, for the designers in the audience, probably a well-known term, but this means things are turned at 45 degrees and the relationship between the X, Y, and Z axes are all the same. The second is the development of graphic operations that establish relationships between objects and the narrative. So, you know, when something appears in the animation and then slowly fades back into the background, or remains on the screen and is transparent, or becomes black and white. So you start to establish relationships between parts of the archival research with each other. And I think they can begin to establish new ways of seeing the research. So the third is that I believe this can be sort of a new form of research, one that is nuanced and can be experienced by many people. A lot of scholarly work is done in the form of papers, and I think that a graphic representation of both archival research and text-based research can be really strong, and also much more exportable and accessible to a larger public. So this shows, this is a little bit of a preview of the 3 sections of the animation, of the research that I have undertaken, but I'm just showing you the first section to be brief. All 3 of these locations have something to do with oil, the repatriation of land to the Muskogee Creek Nation, and Oklahoma territories themselves. So part 1 is Cushing, part 2 is the Cushing Basin, and part 3 is Tulsa. And again, I'm only sharing part 1 today, but the other 2 parts I can share at another time, or they're online too. Many of these photos and videos were found at the Oklahoma Historical Society with a lot of help from the historians there. So here you're seeing the use again of the 45-degree axonometric section. And so this does a couple of things. First, it preserves the integrity of most of the archival documents as they're likely scanned in squares. You don't have to skew them in order to represent them accurately. The second is it shows the importance of what's below ground, the section aspect. So often we are accustomed to seeing maps and images that typically describe only what's on the surface of the earth and above. So much in the same way that image making can be a sort of form of resistance, we can start making the invisible visible. The second point is the development of graphic operations that establish relationships between objects and the narrative. So here, textual documents with graphs, with overlaid animation are all interacting with each other in a way that is nonlinear, and I think can start to allow people to read and experience the research in a different way. And the third is this new form of research, one that is much more nuanced, allowing the interplay of the materials to produce new ways of thinking about the problem. And I think it's a little bit more culturally accessible than, again, textual work. So again, looking at things in an axonometric view as well as in sections. So here are the three different sites of my research, the first being Cushing, the second being the Cushing Basin, which underlies the western edge of the Muskogee Creek Nation boundary, and then the third being Tulsa itself, which also has a boundary of the Creek Nation territory. But here you can also see the surfaces are connected in various ways, but also the connection of the subsurface. So via pipeline, aquifer, oil basin, etc. Here again, the second point is this interplay and the development of graphic operations that establish these relationships between objects and the narrative. So this is a snapshot from one of the animations, and on the right-hand side, it shows the boundary of the Muskogee Creek Nation and a lot of its ecological features, so water bodies and topography. And that, as it's juxtaposed with pieces of material that come in and out of the screen. On the left-hand side, you see an application for allotment, and on the bottom left, a meets and bounds description of an allotment. So it's very sort of methodical, technical way, as it's just juxtaposed with a more ecological view of the Creek Nation. I think is very interesting, and it might lead us to make different conclusions or think differently about the land. And then finally, this snapshot that just shows an interplay between archival photographs, archival newspaper, a homesteading certificate, and then underlaid is the lands open for settlement, that part of the narrative, the animation that I had shown before, animation that I overlaid onto it. And so it's this multimedia collaborative approach to actually creating something that is very both textually rich, but also very engaging from a visual standpoint. So before we end on that, I want to revisit Ranya's charge to and ask myself sort of what I ground myself in, what I draw upon. So for me, I draw upon the fundamentals of climate justice, that the burdens of our carbon-dependent Earth not fall disproportionately on people of color and those without appropriate visibility in our legal and cultural systems. I also draw upon discourse around climate change that often abstracts particulars of real places in order to make larger points about our global dilemma. So to counteract this phenomenon, I lean on the fundamentals of geography and geology to ground this work in real space. So through this research and various writings, I set the groundwork for my research that would address mechanisms of territorialization, specifically those brought about by the extraction of oil. So my work also draws upon the fundamentals of axonometry, section, and animation, utilizing this representation technique to see both broadly and deeply, and to create relationships between parts of historical and contemporary narratives that are often nonlinear. So through this presentation, I hope to have left you with a better understanding of the history of how McGirt came to be. And I hope to also have left those of you who are designers and urban thinkers with the charge to think more deeply about your projects, your sites, their complicated histories, and to use mapping, countermapping, and visual narrative tools to communicate those histories. Thank you. I don't know if we can hear you, Alex.
Sorry, I was muted. Technology. So if anyone has any questions, we ask that you type them in the Q&A section on your screen. If I will also be checking the chat section. But yeah, if anyone has any questions or comments, put them in the Q&A section. We have one question so far, and it is, can you explain how you collaborated with the tribes in Oklahoma to conduct your research?
Yeah, so I was able to do a couple of weeks of archival research and sort of in-person research, since I was living in Boston at the time, in Oklahoma. And part of that was funded by the Harvard Native American program, as I had said. And so I'm very thankful for that, that grant to do that research. But when I was down in Oklahoma, I met with several different tribal members. I had conversations with the attorneys general of the Muskogee Creek Nation. And at that time, Carpenter versus Murphy was being set to be heard in the Supreme Court. And so a lot of the tribal members that I was speaking with both didn't feel like, they weren't very optimistic that it was going to be decided in favor of the tribes, but also couldn't talk a whole lot about the case itself. And so a lot of my interactions with people in the tribe were asking just simply about the development of oil on lands, on tribal lands. And so in those conversations, I had learned that currently it's not hugely profitable for the tribe, and that could be further compounded based on this double taxation scheme if the particulars of McGirt fall in a certain way where Oklahoma and the tribes can both tax oil operations there. I also, and this is not really shown in these animations, but read the reports that the Muskogee Creek Nation would publish based on their environmental outlooks. And some of the other animations talk a little bit about a more speculative approach to how the tribe would, based on those reports, would pursue energy development on their lands that is outside of the oil industry.
Thank you. We have another question. Did your office receive a grant to do this work? And then if so, through which entity? I know you mentioned a grant, but he was asking through which entity.
Yeah, so when I was at the Graduate School of Design, I received a grant from the Native American program. And then since then have been working and founded Plural Office with my partner, Josh. And so this is sort of self-directed work. We have two parts of our company. One is a more traditional practice of architecture, and the other is research-based. So at this point in time, the architectural part funds the research part. And hopefully that changes in the future where I can be applying for grants and pursuing this, the research further. But I also, I thank the Society of Urban Design students too for allowing me to present here and offering a grant too for this work.
We're happy you're here as well. So another question, is this webinar going to be uploaded somewhere? I would like to revisit it and contact Adelle as my work in Peru is very related.
Yeah, I mean, I'd be happy to share my contact information also. I think this question brings up something that is kind of interesting. At times I've been so absorbed in this research that, think that Oklahoma is the only place in the world that has these really unique conditions of tribal relocation and oil and gas development. And that's just simply not the case. And so I think one of the things I learned when I was in grad school and doing this research was that comparative studies are really, really helpful to better understand and reflect on the conditions that you're researching. So doing comparative studies like in Peru, for example, or even in the United States context, Alaska has a really unique history as it relates to tribes and oil as well. And yeah, there are areas in Oaxaca too that are being sought after for global wind development credits. And the indigenous people of Oaxaca are also sort of fighting that same struggle between energy development and sovereignty.
So we have a comment and question combo. Thank you for your presentation. Do you foresee our state's complicated history to further complicate its future in regard to urban design and planning? And if so, how? And what primary practices do you suggest we incorporate to approach knowing better and doing better as designers in the future?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I think for me, sort of complexity is a very exciting thing. And I know in legal terms, as the particulars of this case and the outcomes of this case are being negotiated by the tribal councils in the state right now, that's probably not, they probably don't find the thrill of a complex problem like I do. But I think for urban designers and planners, it's this amazing challenge to start to see things differently. So like I said, I went to OU in architecture, learned 99% of my education has been about Western methods of doing things. And I think that this case opens our eyes a little bit more to different ways of knowing and seeing things and coexisting with people who have sort of non-Western views and perhaps urban practices. And so I think the really cool opportunity exists in a potential collaboration with, if you're in Tulsa, the Muskogee Creek Nation, and to really better understand what it means to be an urban designer on reservation land. I think that's an amazing challenge. And, I would start by, and if you're in Tulsa, the person who asked this question, if you're in Tulsa, then the territory that you exist on now is the Muskogee Creek Nation reservation land. But for anyone else who's tuning in, the land acknowledgement that I gave at the beginning, understanding that I'm on the traditional homelands of the Tonkawa tribe and others, there's a really great website you can go to. Just starts the process of better understanding where you are in the world and on whose land you are on. And it's native-land.ca. And so it's geospatial data that you can type in your address and it'll tell you the tribes that moved through that area and have called their traditional homelands in the past. So I think it's, to sort of sum it up, the complexity, I think, is a challenge for urban designers and planners to expand your view of what it means to design in general, but also to design with different cultural values in mind.
We have another question. Have you been able to contact the tribes after the Supreme Court decision? And what has been the reaction and discussion about the territory and property?
And so no, I haven't contacted the tribes afterwards. I think that would be a great next step. One thing that I would love to be able to do is to not only just show this research, but actually be able to teach the skills, because I think the most important part is empowering those who, you know, those who need a platform and to be able to represent their own histories in certain ways. And so I think part of that might be, you know, teaching GIS or animation or, yeah. So I think, yeah, contacting the tribe and picking up this collaboration would be great. I reached out to my, I took a class at the Harvard Law School called American Indian Law, and I reached out to my professor there who I was in very close contact with, and he helped direct some of this research while I was in graduate school. And he was just beside himself. That even then, he didn't think that this would be decided in favor of the tribes. So I think it's, I think everyone's probably still reeling. It's only been several months.
So we got another one. So the main thing about designing in Indian territory will be communication with both state and tribes having authority over the land on which it is built. That's a question. What does that mean for code enforcement and regulation?
Yeah, so again, I'm not a legal scholar, and so I don't really know. I think those particulars are being worked out right now. But, you know, I do know from the design perspective, you can only just open your eyes a little bit wider and form other collaborations, not just with, you know, the tribe or other designers, but I feel really strongly about sort of this method of research and visual representation, because it opens up so many different channels to collaborate with people, lawyers, historians, geographers, geologists, and we as designers have such a unique skill set to be able to gather information, collaborate, and then represent things visually. And so I can only speak from that perspective as a designer, and not as someone who, I don't know exactly what will change, but I'm sure that will become more clarified as time goes on.
So we got a couple more. Do the tribes currently have corporation commissions or environmental regulatory agencies? Have you heard of any plans to expand tribal regulatory authority?
Yeah, I think same answer. I haven't heard of any plans, but I do know that in my research, I've referenced the Creek Nation's sort of energy outlook that they publish every year. I don't know if that commission on the environment on their energy sector has put anything out based on the recent decision, but I'm sure that that is one of the more active parts of thinking about this case. But again, I don't speak for the tribe, and I'm just sort of speculating on that because I'm not involved in any sort of legal practice.
Gotcha. This is one. Do you have any experience with tribal treaties that were originally with the French or Spanish or others and were upheld by the feds as the current governing body?
No, I don't. But I think that's, I mean, to me, when I hear a question like that, it begs sort of a map. Like, how do you find that information and how do you map it? So I'll go back, because I don't have experience in that, but I'll go back to the first animation that I had, or the second animation that I had shown about tribes that had been relocated to Indian territory, and then subsequently their land was ceded to the US. So I'll just talk a little bit about the procedure. Let me pull this up. The procedure of making that data. So whoever's asking this, if you're a designer, then I challenge you to do this. So this was, like I had said in the part of this talk, it was an aggregation of both spreadsheets that I had been compiling, dates of relocation by all these different tribes, dates of land cession, and then pairing that with a geospatial boundary. So say, for example, this one, pairing that with both a time that the tribe was relocated there and then a time where their land had been ceded. And so the most fascinating part about doing research like this is you're creating completely original data. You're intersecting land cessions in time and letting those things play out and animate them in a timeline. And so I think that the thrill of creating original data and being able to literally see this play out is so powerful. So I would think, if you can find even a couple of dates and treaty boundaries of these, then, and GIS or some other tool to help you locate these things in space and animate them, then I think it would be an amazing way to talk and see and share that knowledge about former treaties with governments other than the United States.
So we have a comment from Natalie Cornett, who I know she's an attorney, and she commented and said, to the previous question regarding local regulations, code enforcement, pre-McGirt, SCOTUS, SCOTUS cases have carved out zoning and land use regulation from tribal authority for non-Indian owned free land. So she was kind of helping with that question.
Thank you. Yeah, and SCOTUS is the Supreme Court of the United States. SCOTUS, yeah.
Okay, gotcha. Didn't put that together right away. So we have a comment. She just said, this was engaging and facilitated understanding of an impressive history in a manner that just speaking or using a flat PowerPoint wouldn't have achieved. Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. I really appreciate that comment too. I think that hopefully this illustrates the power of animation and the power of being able to use different types of archival material to illustrate things a little bit more clearly than, again, in a PowerPoint, even reading a document. And yeah, I think it's a skill set that designers have and should be using for more political aims, to be quite frank about it. We have a challenge and a charge to be political beings in this time, in this strange world, and to use our skill set to, again, make the things that have often been invisible visible. I think it's really powerful. And not just be, as I'll speak for myself, I have been in the past through architecture, is a little bit more reactive instead of proactive in helping bring to light some of these untold narratives.
Well, I think that's all we have as far as questions go so far. So if anyone else has some last minute comments or questions, feel free to post them. But if not, this was really awesome. And on behalf of the Society of Urban Design Students, I'd like to thank you again, Adelle, for spending your time with us and showing this really cool way to show research, and also just being here today. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you all. I really appreciate the comments and the feedback. And yeah, I'm excited to see how this all plays out together. So thank you again.
All right, I think that's all we have. Sean asked, where will this be posted?
Oh, is that to me?
I think it's to whoever's posting it.
Okay.
I think Bonnie is recording it, correct? Or did you record it?
Yes, I recorded it. I don't know. We'll have to discuss, but we can get back with you, Sean, on that, and everybody.
Yeah, and to whoever's still on, I have several animations, the full length animations posted on my Vimeo, and I'm happy to share that as well, if anyone's interested. So, great. Thank you both. Thank you all. Take care.
Take care.